Um, really excited. This is a longtime friend of the WhyTry organization that we are just really excited to be able to have on to share your story and let us learn from you. So the webinar today, we're going to be talking about kind of lessons from history and how we can help all students to make education a lifelong process. And we are really excited to have Reverend Dr. Owen Cardwell on with us, longtime friend of the WhyTry organization. I was fortunate enough to do a training that Dr. Cardwell attended in Virginia a couple years ago. That was when I first met you, and then we've just been able to work with you organizationally throughout the years, and just become a real good friend of our organization. We consider you family now. Welcome, Dr. Cardwell. Thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here.
So I'm going to give you a little bit more of a formal introduction. I'm going to tell our attendees a little bit about what your background is, and then we'll get right into the discussion. And really, I'm excited for our attendees to hear a little bit about your story, because it's really important, especially right now during Black History Month. I think your story and what we can learn from your lifetime of experience and research is really important to how we can serve kids today. So just a little bit of background on our guest, Reverend Dr. Owen Cardwell. On January 29th, 1962, Owen Cardwell and Linda Woodruff became the first two African-American students to attend E.C. Glass High School in Lynchburg, Virginia. In March of that same year, Dr. Martin Luther King came to Lynchburg in support of the desegregation efforts. And once Owen met Dr. King, his life trajectory changed. Dr. Cardwell has been in the ministry for 50 years. Reverend Cardwell has been in the ministry for 50 years. Received a PhD in Interdisciplinary Studies from Union Institute and University in Cincinnati. His concentration is ethical and creative leadership with a specialization in Martin Luther King studies. He's the 2015 recipient of the Dr. Tony A. Gregory Dissertation Award and the 2016 recipient of the Dr. Virgil A. Wood Award for the Martin Luther King Jr. dissertation. He obtained a Bachelor of Arts from Virginia Seminary and College in Lynchburg, a Master's of Theology from Boston University, and a Master's of Education from Cambridge College in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then in June 1997, he received the honorary doctorate in sacred literature from the Spirit of Truth Institute in Richmond, Virginia Seminary. He's completed course requirements for the PhD in counseling from Liberty University. And education has been part of your whole life, hasn't it?
Yeah, I've been a lifelong student. Hint, hint.
I love it. Go ahead.
I said hint, hint.
We're going to come back to that, right?
Yeah.
Dr. Cardwell is also the Roselle Schule Distinguished Professor of Education and Director of the Center for Education and Leadership at University of Lynchburg. He's the founder and pastor of the New Canaan International Church in Richmond, Executive Director for Heroes and Dreams Academy. The list goes on. Just an incredible resume of both life experience, professional experience, and academic experience, and has worked extensively as well through one of his foundations with supporting, incarcerated individuals. The list goes on. Welcome, Owen. We could not be more excited to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm excited to be here. WhyTry, the WhyTry family are a group of one of my favorite people.
Well, thank you so much. We feel the same. It's just going to be me and you today. My name's Jason Johnson. For those that I haven't had the chance to meet yet that are on here, my background is I'm a school psychologist. I've been with the WhyTry organization for about almost 6 years now. Came over from public ed, and I've been the lucky one that gets to do and moderate these webinars. And this one is, I think it'll hopefully have a little bit more personal and conversational nature, because I'm excited just to try to get Dr. Cardwell talking and sharing his story because it is really inspiring and I think very relevant to how we can support kids today. And so with that, I wanna jump right into it and let's hear from you. You good with that, Dr. Cardwell?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I want you to first, I was hoping you could first tell us just a little bit about your history and your experience being one of the first students of color to be integrated into Virginia public education, because that I think was a critical moment where things really kind of started on that trajectory for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I can do that. I would like to contextualize it a little bit. I, along with perhaps some on this webinar today, watched the PBS special the last two nights, hosted by Skip Gates from Harvard University on the history of the Black church. And it was not lost to me that I was birthed in the Black church. The civil rights movement was birthed in the Black church. Education in the Black community was birthed out of the Black church, and so I just want to give acclaim and an affirmation to how important the African American church has been to our development. And it's with that, my good friend and a lifelong mentor, Dr. Virgil Alexander Wood, had come to Lynchburg in the late 50s, early 60s to become pastor of Diamond Hill Baptist Church. And he had had the experience as a student at Virginia Union University of meeting Martin Luther King Jr. In Martin's early days. Dr. Wood, when he came to town, became one of the board members of SCLC and was the leader of the civil rights movement there in Lynchburg. He and my father became fast friends. And so a call went out in the community for students that wanted to participate in a suit against Lynchburg City Schools to bring down the barriers of segregation. Group started out with about 32, met at Diamond Hill Baptist Church, but because of economic pressures from the majority community, that group of 32 got whittled down to 4. Linda Woodruff, Brenda Hughes, and Cecilia Jackson. And it so happened that our parents, the 4 of us, our parents, all worked for either the Black community or worked for the federal government. So a lawsuit ensued. We were allowed to attend E.C. Glass High School on January 29th, 1962. And I did not discover until years later that was no favor to us, because going to school like that in the middle of a school year, I came to realize was designed for our failure. And the group of 4 were broken up by the courts. It was made a determination by the courts that based on IQ scores, that Linda and I could go in the middle of the school year, and Brenda and Cecilia would have to wait until the beginning of the next school year, which would have been our 10th grade year. So Linda and I were there by ourselves that first semester in 1962. And as you indicated, on March 27th, Dr. King came to Lynchburg in support of the desegregation efforts.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit more, maybe talk about your involvement, kind of what happened from that point going forward when Dr. King came through, what that did for you and kind of the trajectory that put you on as far as involvement in civil rights, kind of from that moment on into adulthood.
Well, ironically, Jason, EC Glass, because it was a public institution, the assembly hall there was open to the public, even though we had to sue to be able to go to school there. So Martin Luther King actually gave his Lynchburg speech in the auditorium at EC Glass High School.
Wow.
During those days, of course, travel for African Americans in the South, there were very few hotels, no Holiday Inns, no Marriotts. People either stayed at Black-owned hotels or they stayed in people's homes. So Dr. King stayed in the home of Dr. George Jackson, who was Cecilia's father. And that night after the rally at EC Glass, all of us, actually anyone from the group of 32, and I don't remember now how many out of that group of 32 actually came, but they were invited to come also because they helped pave the way. And I distinctly remember sitting on the floor with Dr. King singing freedom songs. Little did I know at the time, at 15, you don't have a sense of history, even if you're involved in the making of it. We were just doing what we were doing, and I had no idea the impact that encounter would have on my life. I became a preacher, like Dr. King was a preacher. I went to Boston University, like Dr. King went to Boston University. In my doctoral studies, I ended up being specializing in King studies, which ostensibly makes me a King scholar. And so Martin Luther King ended up playing an extremely important role. My father took me to the March on Washington, so I had a chance to hear the I Have a Dream speech firsthand. And it also set me off on a path to be more of an activist. So of the group of four of us, Brenda Hughes and I made a determination that we were also going to be activists, and we ended up being youth leaders in the civil rights movement, which did not help my situation at school, as you can well imagine.
Yeah, I was going to ask what you talked about kind of the moment or moment in time where you got into the high school. What was the remainder of high school like for you after you got into that school? What was that like?
Well, I mentioned the IQ scores. We had to have IQs higher than 95% of the kids we were going to be going to school with. Not only had I been on the honor roll at Dunbar, which was the Black school, but I was number one in my class at the time. We went in the middle of our ninth grade year, and I didn't make honor roll again until my senior year. It wasn't because the work was any harder. It was because of the emotional and sometimes near physical stress.
Wow, thank you. Would you mind talking a little bit more about what your more recent work has been? I know you've had some significant work on your dissertation that I mentioned, a book that you've worked on, as well as what that experience has been, and maybe even talk a little bit about. I think there's some people that may not be familiar with what the route of Martin Luther King's studies is, and maybe talk a little bit about that as well. So I guess talk a little bit about what your more recent work has been involved in along those lines.
Well, the early days of the civil rights movement, the focus was fairly simplistic, and I don't know that people really think about that. The focus was public access to public venues and access to public education. The sit-in demonstrations at lunch counters, all those kinds of things we participated in Lynchburg, in our local situation. I helped to desegregate the Paramount and Warner theaters at that time. They were the predominantly white theaters, even though we had a black-owned theater there in Lynchburg also. But if you went to one of the white theaters, you had to sit in the balcony. There was a separate entrance. So we desegregated those theaters. We also desegregated a national restaurant chain across the South. It was called S&W Cafeterias. And so while we participated in the desegregation of the schools, we also participated in getting access to public spaces. But the irony also is that in public education, we are essentially still fighting those battles that we fought 60 years ago. They've taken on a different name now, achievement gap. Some have become a bit more sophisticated, called it an opportunity gap, a resource gap. I don't like the concept of achievement gap because it implies that somehow there's a deficiency in the learner, and I don't think that that's necessarily the case. But there is a gap, and COVID has helped to disclose how that gap has been exacerbated through what we have to do with online education and the disparity in the community, primarily around economic conditions, where some families have access to internet, some families don't have access to internet, and even where internet is available, those families don't necessarily have the tools, the computers or the like, to be able to adequately utilize them. And while people point out that poor folks have smartphones, you can't really do your schoolwork sufficiently on a smartphone. I mean, you can do a lot of things, but can you imagine trying to do your homework and schoolwork on a smartphone? So these disparities in educational access are being exacerbated, and we're still fighting the same battles. And at the bottom rung are African American males. Now, in our public school setup, both behavior and very often academic standing are normed around white females, because even white males, and some might argue, that Asians do even better, and to some extent that might be true, but that's because of a cultural issue there very often. But at the bottom rung is always African American males in their performance. Now, you would have to be really stretching it to honestly believe that African American males are that much less capable than their counterparts in other racial groups. So we've been doing a lot of work with African American males, and when you do that work, you are confronted with what my good friend Dr. Virgil Wood and I came to coin as the jail trail. Now, we hear a lot of talk about the school to prison pipeline, but a pipeline has a visual of restriction. Pipeline is restricted. A trail, there is hope of being able to reverse direction. So we came up with this concept of the jail trail. And so you have the front end of the jail trail, where you want to try to keep young people from going down the pathway that would get them connected to the criminal justice system. that becomes difficult when the behavior of African American boys in school are highlighted so that an African American boy faces a stricter consequence for the same action that his white counterpart might do. So we're trying to keep these kids off of the jail trail. Then you have the middle part of the jail trail, which actually deals with those who are incarcerated. And again, my friend Dr. Wood talks about turning prisons into universities. And then, of course, you have that group, because even though people go to jail, 99% of them are going to come home at some point. And the question is, what do you do with them? Because they've got these marks on them. And so we try to work with families in preparing for children to come home. And at the heart and core of all of this is the idea that education can lift everybody out of these conundrums that they find themselves in.
Thank you. Would you mind just sharing, maybe giving a little more context on what you're doing kind of foundationally when you talk about trying to help kids off of that jail trail, help individuals off of that? Do you mind talking just a little bit about what your foundation is that you work with, and kind of how you do that, what that looks like in conjunction with the community?
Yeah, you mentioned our Heroes and Dreams Academy, which is more of a virtual academy now. That nonprofit was part of the work at New Canaan International Church, which I'm retired from. Now I pastor the same church that Dr. Virgil Wood pastored when he came to Lynchburg. Once I retired from New Canaan, I had no idea that I was going to go back into ministry, but God had something else in mind. But nevertheless, the work that we did with Heroes and Dreams Academy, we have now transferred that work to the Center for Education and Leadership at the University of Lynchburg. And over the years, we've been able to attract national partners like WhyTry, the Gallup people. We use the Gallup Strength Finder in our work. We've worked with an organization out of San Diego that does career and technical education support called Journeys. And just whatever partners we can find, we try to bring them to bear in working with primarily African American males, but we don't turn away anybody. We've always worked with whosoever will let them come concept. But we've had to work with children who had incarcerated parents. We've had to work with mentoring programs for young people. We've carried that work on at the University of Lynchburg. We are currently working on a project with Lynchburg City Schools that's focusing on using a strength-based approach to education so that education is not seen primarily as a destination. You graduate from high school, or you go to community college, or you get a bachelor's degree. Those are kind of destination spots, but that we can create in the people that we work with a passion for lifelong learning, because we are, in fact, students for life. Part of what created this destination is the necessity of an agrarian culture that had kids to be in school during the months where the harvest was not taking place, because kids had to be there to help harvest, the crops. And so we've maintained that model, moving kids along at the same pace, at the same time. You have to hit these various benchmarks, but everybody's kind of expected to hit it pretty much at the same. And of course, you got people that can always go ahead of the benchmarks and those that lag behind. And so we create this kind of a competition when the competition ought to be against what I'm capable of doing, my current performance against what I'm capable of doing. And we have the technology to be able to do that. We have MOOC courses that are available. We've got organizations like Khan Academy that can provide opportunities. And who says that everybody has to learn the same thing at the same time? So if we use this strength-based approach, it becomes learning on demand, whatever you need and want to learn at this particular time to foster the strengths and aspirations that you have. Those are the things you focus on. If you don't really need ninth grade algebra in the ninth grade, and you can wait, and I know that I'm kind of crossing things up here because we need to get away from this graded system. But for the purpose of argument, if you don't need ninth grade algebra until you're actually in the 12th grade, why are we forcing that issue? Maybe if each child had their own individualized education plan and the teacher, rather than serving as instructor in the classroom, the teacher became a learning facilitator, maybe we would not have these gaps and disparities that we see. Now, folks can argue with me about whether that is doable or not, but we don't know whether we can do it until we at least attempt to do it.
Thank you. I love hearing you talk about this because you've been involved in education at every level your whole life, and when somebody with your type of experience starts to talk about these ideas, my ears perk up because I really do respect your perspective on that. Thank you. I want to circle back on just a couple things maybe. So right now, we're in a kind of a unique moment in time, and you talked about it a little bit at the beginning. The pandemic has obviously brought a lot of things to surface that were there. They were issues that were there and kind of bubbling up under the surface for a long time, but the pandemic has really kind of brought them more into the forefront. I was just wondering if you could maybe, how do you connect your life's work and your history directly to today's world and today's students? What lessons do you take away from your significant experience that might apply directly to supporting today's students through today's challenges?
Well, this has been a tremendous challenge for everyone on the education spectrum, whether you're a teacher, whether you're support personnel. My wife happens to be the human resources director for Lynchburg City Schools, and so she has to deal with this from the school personnel aspect. Children are all over the spectrum, from children who are doing extremely well because they are well supported. They've got the resources, they've got parental support. They can afford to have tutors if necessary, all the way down to kids who like a couple of kids that I read about. I believe they were in San Diego, California. At least their mother was resourceful. She would take them to, I believe it was a Burger King or some fast food restaurant, and they would sit outside and use the internet connection outside of the restaurant to be able to do their schoolwork while their mother. Well, that's real innovation on the mother's part, because clearly she could not afford to provide for her children, but she was determined that they were going to get the same access to education. And so we've got all these access issues that are being exposed. And, you know, I'm a college professor, and we were just beginning the semester last year when all of a sudden three classes into the course, we were thrown into having to learn how to operate with distance learning and learn the technology. If we were having difficulty with it, imagine the difficulty that the kids were having. And so we're seeing numbers like 50-60% of the kids are having failing grades that didn't fail before. Here, even in Lynchburg, I think the superintendent recently said that something like 20% of the kids have never even logged in. You know, and so the school system is struggling to identify those kids, to reach out to them, and it just ought not be this way, particularly when, as I said, we have the structure over the internet to be able to do this. We just have not adequately used it in a way that everybody can thrive. There's no reason why these kids should be struggling. Now, it takes a different skill set to be able to play video games than it does to be able to do your schoolwork and homework. But if these kids can figure out how to play their video games, how to use all these different apps on their phone, then all it takes is someone really just making the connection for them and with them as to how that can translate into their ability to be able to do their schoolwork. It's going to take some creativity, and I know that teachers are frustrated, and I know that folks are fearful about getting back in the classroom face to face, lack of vaccination. But we're talking about this stuff going on in America. We are supposed to be the best resource nation on the planet.
Amen. Thank you. The couple of things you made me think of, and I think this is one of the reasons that we've always kind of found kinship with you and your approach. You know, you're talking about the resourcefulness necessary. I mean, that's like a vital ingredient of resilience. So the WhyTry organization, our focus is really resilience. We try to teach the skills and the sources of resilience through SEL delivery, and resourcefulness is a major part of it. The other thing that you mentioned that's intriguing to me, and I think it just kind of came together in my mind as you were articulating it so well, was this concept of thriving. And I think that's where a lot of the gaps that get described, in different ways that you talked about, that's really, I think, what they're reflecting is when you have systemic pieces that allow some kids to thrive and others not to thrive, that really becomes problematic. And so you have some kids that may be getting by, they may be surviving, but survival is not thriving. And when we're limiting kids' ability to thrive, it becomes really hard to ever get ahead or even just stay, on course. And so I think that thriving piece really is central to the concept of resilience, and really just getting, access to adequate. It shouldn't just be access to adequate services. It should be services that allow a kid to thrive. Any concepts on that concept of thriving? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, because this might be a backdoor way of getting at it, but I'll get there. So be patient. You see, we have created this false competitive crucible, if you will, that moves everybody along at the same pace. And so the originator of Khan Academy, I heard him do a piece on this, I think on a TED Talk or something. But he made the analogy that, you know, if you look at this as building a building, you lay the foundation, and then you have a quiz, and you know, somebody gets a 70, somebody gets an 85, and somebody gets a 90. Well, then you go to the next concept. We call that the first floor. But you're laying this on a foundation that has some gaps in it because the core concepts were not mastered. And so we force people to move along at the same pace rather than to focus on giving individuals a chance to master core concepts. So in that competitive situation where somebody gets a 70, somebody gets an 85, somebody gets a 90, the one that gets the 90 is perceived to thrive, and maybe the one with the 85 will kind of get a pass. But what happens to the one with the 70? He or she has been forced in this situation to now move on to the next concept, and they haven't grasped the previous one. So they're not thriving through no real fault of their own. They're not thriving because of the way that the system is set up.
So it's not supporting them sufficiently to be able to thrive. Then we have to move them along because that's the course that we've committed to. And meanwhile, it's limiting the ability to thrive all along. And when we limit our ability to thrive, we limit our access to opportunity, and it just has a domino effect.
Absolutely.
Wow, thank you. You've articulated that really well. I appreciate that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I've heard you mention, if you've mentioned it today, and then just in our personal conversation. And by the way, I really do value every conversation that we've been able to have. I feel like I learned something new from you every time I get to talk to you. But I've heard you talk about this concept of making education a lifelong process rather than just a destination. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to elaborate a little bit on that, and then maybe even share some practical strategies that you think could help educators with that concept, how they could move more towards that concept.
Well, yeah. You know, I wrote my dissertation around an autoethnography, looking at how I progressed and developed as a young person into a youth leader in the civil rights movement. And I used a couple of working theories in an interdisciplinary fashion. I used Joseph Campbell, The Heroic Journey. I use Otto Scharmer's Theory U. I use Ken Wilber's shucks, I'll think of it in a moment. But his nickname, The Theory of Everything. But you can Google Ken Wilber because it slipped my memory now because my mind has just gone down another trail. Anyhow, and so after I got my doctorate, you know, my intention was to use that in the work with the nonprofit. A door opened for me to be able to come to the University of Lynchburg. I was invited to come there as a distinguished professor, and so my work kind of transitioned there. And so I've been trying to take that dissertation and to rewrite it so that it's not such an academic piece, but rather might be used, you know, in the popular market. I've probably got a couple of chapters to go to actually publish that, but the working title is called A Handbook for African American Male Development, because as I said previously, African American males seem to be at the bottom of this gap, however we constitute it. And so all of this idea about education as a destination has been ingrained in people's minds to the point that it's not uncommon to hear a young person say, well, I just want to be able to graduate from high school, or to be told that you need to have at least some kind of degree, so why don't you go to community college? And so businesses really support the idea of community college because they can partner with community colleges to get at least some skilled workers, and those that are a bit more fortunate go to college, more go than finish, of course. So we've kind of created these destinations rather than to look upon education as a lifelong experience. It took me 3 bites at the apple to get my PhD. I was in 3 different doctoral programs before I settled on this one. Well, I don't necessarily recommend that for everybody else, but that was the course that I took. That was my heroic journey. So let me get to this whole idea of a heroic journey. Part of my dissertation was an argument with Joseph Campbell, because he laid out this path called the heroic journey, the framework of which is seen in pretty much any action movie or hero movie that you see coming out of Hollywood. And now in the age of Netflix, it can come from anywhere.
Right.
But there are three stages in Campbell's original work, 17 steps. And the idea is that you get this calling and you cross the threshold into this adventure where you pick up supports and allies, and you run into difficulties. You go through an apotheosis, which is kind of a death and a resurrection, and you finish your journey and you come back to the place that you left with a boon or a reward, and the idea is that then you use that for the betterment of the people that you had left in the first place to go on this journey. Well, I liked the stages, I liked the steps, but I argued with them that everybody's path, at least in their mind, is not a heroic path. Now, Campbell was not talking about a hero with an S on their chest. He wasn't talking about necessarily the Martin Luther Kings and Nelson Mandelas and Malcolm X's of our day. He was really kind of talking about ordinary, everyday heroes. But we have people that, at least for a period of time, are on a villain's journey. That's what happens with so many that fill our penal system. At least in the eyes of law and order, they operate on a villain's journey. That does not mean that they can't be redeemed from that. But the vast majority of people, I argue, operate on a victim's journey. They go through, and both villains, victims, and heroes all go through the same steps and stages. It has to do with how they respond to it. So I had this grand idea that if you could train people in the concepts of the heroic journey, and they understood the stages and the steps, when they hit those benchmarks, they would at least recognize where they were and have an opportunity to make a determination about how they should respond, because it wasn't foreign to them and it wasn't something that they had to respond to in real time. They were already immersed or trained that these are the things that are going to take place. And so when they see it, they say, oh, I recognize that. And then Sharma offers this concept of the theory U, where you go from operating from a concept that, I've seen this before, and this is how I responded in the past, so this is how I'm going to respond now, through this kind of U figure that he has, to the ideal of operating from the emerging future, that as the future presents itself, you're able to grasp that. And there's a lot more to the concept, but that's kind of it in a nutshell. So my idea was that, if we can put these things together, that we can begin to work with young people and say, there's no reason why you can't be the hero of your own story. All of us have a story. All of us have a narrative. All of us are engaged in the act of sense making, trying to figure out what all of this means. And then I came in contact with the Gallup Strength Finder assessment. Now, it's not a panacea. It's not the end all and the be all, but at least it provides a language that we can use where you identify your top 5 strengths, and if you work on those strengths, the common fallacy is that you have to work on your weaknesses. No, you have to manage your weaknesses, but build on your strengths. You gain so much more by doing that. So if you know what your strengths are and you focus on building up those strengths, then you can really grow incrementally. And Gallup has determined that only 1 in 256,000 people have the same top 5 strengths. And get this, only 1 in 31 million have the same top 5 strengths in the same order. So it helps the young person to understand you are unique. You are wonderfully and fearfully made.
And so you teach this approach, you like to teach this approach to kids. It makes me think, and this is my school psychology background, but in the world of resilience, one of the ingredients of resilience is a term that gets used called self-efficacy,
Yes.
which is kind of like that confident belief that you can influence your outcomes.
Yes.
And like when you're describing that to me, that's what I'm thinking about, because that's when that self-efficacy disappears, then that's when we let the world kind of act upon us, and we're not trying to actively influence our outcomes. We are just responding to wherever we're at. And I love that, how you describe that. If we can recognize where we're at on that journey, then perhaps we can respond hopefully proactively and really try to influence some of those outcomes. Great insight. Wondering, I think, right now there are a lot of educators that I think are feeling discouraged about a lot of different things. It's obviously been a really hard year. COVID has made things much more difficult. Some of the challenges that have gotten much more significant, including that digital divide that you described, has, I think, resulted in a lot of discouragement. I was wondering, what message do you have for any educators that might be feeling discouraged right now, or just wondering, we talked about a lot of high level things and some kind of deep concepts. What message do you have for educators right now? Maybe even just 1 or 2 practical strategies, something that they could do right now in their small sphere of influence that could really help move towards making education a process rather than a destination, and maybe help lift any discouragement or some of the discouragement that may be out there.
Well, the first thing that I want to do is I want to say to any educator that is on this webinar, you are an American hero. There is no question about it. You have been cast into a very difficult situation, and the fact that you show up every day, you have my deepest admiration for the work that you do. I think that sometimes the temptation is to give more focus to the coursework than to working on the relationship. These kids, as you are well aware, are struggling. On the nightly news, NBC has given to having kids talk about what they are having to deal with, and we see that you see that up close and personal with the young people that you're working at, and I know that it's no easy thing to have to figure out 30 different personalities that are in your class, but the time that you spend on building relationships on the front end will save you a lot of work on the back end. And so while that, whatever the standard of learning is for whatever state you happen to be working in, while that's important, right now, the most important thing is to encourage these young people because they're feeling the stress, and somehow we adults have got to bear the burden. So work on trying to make sure that you don't have relationship with just a few, but that you have figured out at least something that you could connect with every child that you are responsible for.
I love it. Thank you. And that's definitely, I think that was definitely something you and I connected on, and your wife Flora on that um, that first moment I think that we met in that training several years ago. I remember having a conversation with you then on the power of relationships as that critical piece for motivation. It's the vital beginning ingredient for resilience in many cases. And so, organizationally, we absolutely endorse that, as well as you're calling educators heroes. They absolutely are. We're about up on time. Just wondering, any parting thoughts or any final ideas that you want to share? Anything that's bounced into your mind that you didn't get a chance to talk about that you want to share with our attendees today?
Well, I don't want anybody to think that I'm railing against the public education system, because I'm not. I understand how we got here and why it's very difficult to turn an ocean liner on a dime. But we can make, and you might not be able to turn your school district around. You might not even be able to turn your school around. But there are ways that we can focus on strength-based learning in our individual classrooms. Sometimes I get caught up in the big picture and forget the small things that can be done, and that's a temptation that I have to resist from time to time. But we have the capability of doing this. We have the technology to be able to do this. We're never going to go back to delivering education the way that we did prior to COVID. So let's take the good lessons that we've learned out of here and make sure that we don't let them fall by the wayside in a temptation to get back to normal. There's never going to be the normal that we were familiar with. So we're going to have to create a new normal.
I love it. And that's really, how any experience can be kind of channeled towards helping all of us try to thrive. We all want to be resilient. We all want to thrive. It's not just even so. That's interesting now. See, I could go on all day with you. I'm thinking about this concept of thriving. Thriving isn't a destination. Thriving is a process as well. And so when we get through this pandemic, whatever the other side of it looks like, that's not our destination. We need to continue to thrive through this and take those good lessons, just like you mentioned, and then double down on them going forward, right?
Yeah, because you see, I see thriving as the other side of the resiliency coin. Maybe it's called resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you can only bounce so high, but when you resist, there's no need to bounce.
I love it. I love it. All right. Last question for you. What's giving you hope right now? What are you seeing? What are you doing? What are you hearing? What thing is giving you hope right now through all this?
Well, and this is not to blow smoke, because I sincerely mean this. the work that you and Christian and Hans are doing gives me great hope. And it also gives me hope to know that more and more people are beginning to realize that you exist. You have a very important part to play in this whole approach to making learning a lifelong process. And so I'm just so appreciative of being included in the Friends of WhyTry. And I mean this sincerely. I talk about you all everywhere I go. And so you give me hope. And the fact that so many people logged onto this webinar gives me hope that there are those that care enough to expend some of their own personal energy to make this happen.
Wow, thank you. I am honored, absolutely honored to hear you say that. And I feel the same way. My relationships with individuals I've got to meet through this work is definitely what gives me hope. And I gotta be careful because I'm gonna get emotional, but you're a hero to me. You definitely inspire me. And I am so grateful that you came on today and shared your experience with us. I think we can all learn from it, and your knowledge is vast. Your insight on education is incredible. And just thank you on behalf of all of us as an organization, and then a big personal thank you as well. We love you to death, and just think the world of you and your family and your wife, and so grateful you hopped on with us. So in conclusion, big round of applause for Reverend Dr. Cardwell, excuse me, for hopping on with us and sharing his story. And we are really excited. He's actually going to be on a podcast with Christian and Dave, and they're going to be talking with you in more detail about this. It should be coming out pretty soon. It's the Resilience Breakthrough Podcast. And I'm so excited that they got you on there as well to share your story. And I think you talk about a few different things in a little bit more depth than maybe what you talked about today, because today was just the tip of the iceberg. Next week, we're going to have a couple guests on, experts on the topic of college and career readiness. And we're really excited to have them on. We've got some representatives from a couple different universities and a representative from Gear Up, and we're looking forward to that as well. So anyway, big round of applause. The comments, I don't know if you're seeing those, have been very complimentary. You inspired a lot of people today, Dr. Cardwell, and thank you so much for joining us. Hey, bye everybody. I feel so inspired. I hope you all have a great day. I'm going to play us out with some music, huh?
Thanks.